The look on my daughter's face changed so fast it almost would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. One second she was marching through my front door like she owned the place. The next she froze. Her hand tightened around a leather folder. The lawyer standing behind her stopped walking. Nobody said a word. Melissa just stared across my living room. "Dad," she finally said. Her voice sounded smaller than I'd heard in years. "What is she doing here?" I looked over at Diane Harper, who was sitting comfortably in the armchair beside my recliner, sipping coffee from one of my old Dayton Electric mugs. Diane didn't say anything. She simply smiled. Not a smug smile. Not a victorious smile. Just the kind of smile you give someone when you know they're seeing something they never expected. I took a slow sip from my own coffee. "Good afternoon to you too, sweetheart." Melissa didn't answer. The color had drained from her face. And standing there in my living room, staring at Diane like she'd seen a ghost, my daughter looked more nervous than I'd ever seen her in her entire life. The strange thing is, 3 months earlier, I would have done almost anything to get her to visit. Funny how life works. My name is Bob Mitchell. I'm 67 years old. I live outside Dayton, Ohio, in a small ranch house I've owned since Ronald Reagan was president. For 40 years, I ran an electrical contracting company. Nothing fancy. No private jets. No country club memberships. Just service trucks, tool belts, early mornings, and long days. The company started with one pickup truck and a folding card table in my garage. By the time I retired, we had 14 employees. Good people. People who showed up. People who kept their word. When I finally sold the business, I thought life would slow down. In some ways it did. My alarm clock disappeared. I spent more mornings fishing. I drank coffee without looking at my watch every 3 minutes. I learned that retirement isn't really about doing nothing. It's about finally getting to choose what you do. Most Tuesdays, I'd meet my friend Earl at a diner called the Blue Plate Cafe just outside town. Same booth, same waitress, same order. Eggs, wheat toast, and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on a burner since sunrise. I drove the same Ford F-150 I'd owned for years. The truck wasn't pretty, but it started every morning. That's all I cared about. I wasn't living like a wealthy retired businessman, because honestly, I never had. Some people spend money to impress strangers. I never understood that. Unfortunately, somebody else was paying attention. My daughter. Melissa is 38. Smart. Successful. Or at least she appeared successful. She and her husband Todd lived in a newer subdivision about 40 minutes away. Big house, big SUV, big mortgage. The kind of neighborhood where every lawn looks exactly the same. When Melissa was younger, we were close. Very close. Especially after her mother died. She was 16 then. Hard age to lose your mom. Hard age for anything. For years, it felt like the two of us were a team. I attended softball games, college orientation, graduation, wedding planning meetings I never wanted to attend but went to anyway. Then something shifted. Not overnight. Nothing dramatic. Just little changes. The kind you notice only after they've been happening for a long time. Phone calls became shorter. Birthdays got reduced to text messages. Visits happened less often. When I called, she'd say she was busy. When I suggested lunch, she was tied up. When I invited her over, there was always something else going on. At first, I blamed life. People get busy. Jobs happen. Kids happen. Mortgages happen. I understood that. But eventually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Months would pass, sometimes longer. And then out of nowhere, she'd call asking oddly specific questions. "How's the house holding up, Dad? Still managing all the bills okay? You ever think about downsizing?" Questions that seemed harmless. At least at first. One evening last winter, she called while I was watching a Cincinnati Bengals game. After a few minutes of small talk, she asked, "You still handling all your finances yourself?" The question landed strangely. I laughed. "Who else would be handling them?" "Oh, nobody, just wondering." Then she changed the subject. I didn't think much about it then. I wish I had. The call that really got my attention came in early spring. A former employee named Rick called me one Saturday morning. Rick had worked for me nearly 20 years. Good electrician. Even better gossip. After we talked about fishing and retirement, he hesitated. Then he said, "Bob, I probably shouldn't ask this, but are you doing okay?" I laughed. "Last time I checked." He got quiet. Then he said, "Melissa was telling people you're having memory problems." I remember staring out the kitchen window. The bird feeder hung motionless in the backyard. Nothing moved. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "What?" Rick sounded uncomfortable. "I just thought you should know." That conversation stayed with me. Not because I was angry, because I was confused. A week later, Melissa called. And for the first time in months, she sounded unusually warm, almost cheerful. She asked about my health, my finances, my plans. Then she suggested stopping by. Not alone, with a lawyer. According to her, it was just a good opportunity to get some paperwork organized. "Everybody should have this stuff in place, Dad." I agreed to meet. But something didn't feel right. Something in my gut kept bothering me. The day finally arrived on a warm Thursday afternoon. I had coffee ready. The lawyer arrived with Melissa, and waiting beside me was someone Melissa never expected to see. The moment she walked through that front door, everything changed. She stared at Diane. Diane stared back. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I realized my daughter wasn't worried about me. She was worried about what Diane might know. Melissa swallowed hard, then looked directly at me. "Dad," she said quietly, "when did you call her?" I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time all afternoon I smiled. For a few seconds after Melissa asked that question, nobody moved. Even the lawyer looked uncomfortable. Diane finally set her coffee mug down on the side table. "Oh, it's good to see you too, Melissa." The tension in the room could have powered half of Dayton. Melissa forced a smile that fooled absolutely nobody. "I didn't know you were back in Ohio." "I've been back for a while." The lawyer glanced between all of us, clearly realizing he'd walked into a family situation he didn't understand. Melissa quickly changed the subject. She introduced him as Kevin Barnes and explained they only wanted to discuss routine planning documents. I nodded. We exchanged a few polite words. Then I told them I wasn't signing anything that day. Not until I'd reviewed everything thoroughly. Melissa didn't like that answer. I could see it immediately. Her shoulders tightened. Her smile disappeared. The meeting lasted maybe 20 minutes before they left. The moment their car pulled away, Diane looked at me and said, "Well, that was even worse than I expected." I couldn't disagree. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't the lawyer. It was seeing how disappointed Melissa looked when she realized I wasn't alone. Not worried, not relieved, disappointed. That feeling stayed with me long after she left. A lot of people assume revenge stories start with anger. Mine didn't. Mine started with confusion, then sadness, then a slow realization I didn't want to accept. You see, Diane Harper wasn't some mysterious woman from my past. She wasn't a girlfriend. She wasn't a secret fiancé. And despite what Melissa had convinced herself over the years, Diane had never tried to replace my wife. My wife, Karen, passed away from breast cancer 21 years ago. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like another lifetime. After Karen died, life got very small for a while. Work, bills, Melissa, sleep, repeat. I kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. Diane helped during those years, not in some dramatic movie way. She simply showed up. She handled payroll when I couldn't focus. She covered meetings. She checked in. Sometimes she'd bring takeout. Sometimes she'd force me to leave the office before midnight. That was it. Friendship. Nothing more. But 16-year-old Melissa saw things differently. Teenagers often do. She convinced herself Diane wanted something from me. No matter how many conversations we had, that belief never fully disappeared. When Diane eventually moved to Arizona after retiring, Melissa seemed relieved. I thought time would heal that resentment. Apparently not. The truth is, I hadn't spoken to Diane much for several years, beyond occasional phone calls and Christmas cards. Then last winter, everything changed. Not because of one big event, because of 100 little things. Questions, comments, conversations that didn't feel right. One evening, Melissa asked if I'd updated my will. A few weeks later, she asked whether I still used online banking. Another time she asked if I'd considered giving someone power of attorney. Each question by itself seemed harmless. Together they painted a picture. I just couldn't figure out what the picture was. Then came Rick's phone call. The memory problems rumor. That conversation bothered me enough that I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Around that same time, I noticed Melissa had become strangely interested in my finances. She never directly asked how much money I had. She wasn't stupid, but she'd circle around the topic, like somebody walking around a fence trying to find a gate. One afternoon after we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at a family photo. Karen, Melissa, me. Disney World 2003. Melissa was smiling with ice cream all over her face. I remember thinking something that made me feel guilty. I wondered whether my daughter saw me as a father anymore, or as an asset. I hated myself for even considering it. That's when I called Diane. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. At first, I just wanted advice, a second opinion. Someone who knew me well enough to tell me if I was imagining things. By the end of the call, Diane had agreed to fly out and help me review everything. Not because she thought Melissa was guilty, because she thought I deserved clarity. 3 weeks later, Diane arrived. The first thing she did was organize my financial records. The second thing she did was ask questions I hadn't considered. Simple questions. Who had access to what? Who knew what? Who was suddenly showing unusual interest? As we worked through everything, another piece of information surfaced, completely by accident. An old customer of mine mentioned seeing Todd at a real estate investment seminar. That didn't seem important until a mutual acquaintance mentioned Todd had been talking openly about financial pressure. Then another person said something similar. Then another. Soon enough, a pattern emerged. Debt. A lot of debt. Nothing illegal. Nothing criminal. Just bad decisions piled on top of each other. A luxury SUV. Vacation loans. Investment losses. Credit cards. The kind of financial trouble people hide until they can't anymore. Even then, I didn't want to believe it had anything to do with me. I kept looking for another explanation. Then Diane found something. One afternoon, she was helping me sort through paperwork when she stopped reading and looked up. Bob? I didn't like the tone in her voice. What? She slid a page across the table. Take a look at this. The document itself wasn't alarming. What mattered was the inquiry attached to it. Someone had contacted a financial institution asking detailed questions about obtaining authority over an elderly parent's accounts under specific circumstances. No names. No completed paperwork. Just questions. But the timing matched perfectly. And the person asking those questions? Melissa. I sat there for a long time without speaking. Diane didn't push. She just waited. Finally, I said, maybe she's just trying to plan ahead. Diane gave me a sad look. You really want to believe that? She wasn't wrong. I did. Because the alternative hurt. A lot. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation we'd had over the previous year. Every question. Every visit. Every sudden burst of concern. For the first time, I started seeing a pattern I hadn't wanted to see before. And the deeper Diane and I looked, the clearer it became. Melissa wasn't preparing for my future. She was preparing for control. The papers Melissa brought looked harmless. That was the first thing that scared me. They didn't look like some obvious scheme cooked up in the back room of a strip mall law office. They were clean, professional, neatly organized in a blue folder with little sticky tabs on the signature pages. If you glanced at them quickly, you'd think they were just ordinary planning documents. And maybe in another family, they would have been. But in mine, they felt like a locked door someone was trying to hand me the key to. Diane and I sat at my kitchen table the next morning with coffee, reading through every page. My house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of Diane's pen against a yellow legal pad. She had always been good with details. Back when we ran the company together, Diane could spot a billing error from across the room. I'd be standing there thinking everything looked fine, and she'd tap one line with her finger and say, "That's going to cost us if we ignore it." She was usually right. That morning, she didn't say much at first. She just read, then reread, then circled a paragraph. "Bob," she said, This gives Melissa a lot more authority than she described. I leaned closer. How much authority? Diane pushed her glasses up and looked at me. Enough to make decisions about accounts, property, and investments if certain conditions are claimed. I felt my stomach tighten. Claimed by who? That's one of the problems. We went through it slowly. The language wasn't dramatic. That's how legal papers work. They don't announce danger with flashing lights. They hide it under words like prudent, necessary, and best interest. But the meaning was clear enough. If I signed, Melissa could gain broad control over my finances under the argument that I needed assistance. The documents weren't automatically criminal. They weren't fake, but they were wide open to abuse in the wrong hands. And I was beginning to understand whose hands those might be. Later that afternoon, Diane called Kevin Barnes. Not to threaten him, not to accuse him, just to ask questions. She put him on the speaker while I sat across from her, arms folded, trying not to feel like a fool. Kevin sounded professional at first. Careful, polite. Then Diane asked, Mr. Barnes, what exactly were you told about Bob's condition? There was a pause. Mrs. Mitchell expressed concerns about his ability to manage certain affairs. I sat up straighter. Diane's eyes flicked toward me. Mrs. Mitchell? Melissa Mitchell, he clarified. His daughter. What kind of concerns? Another pause. Memory issues, confusion, difficulty keeping track of bills, possible vulnerability. I looked down at my own hands. They were rough hands, old hands, scarred from wire cuts and busted knuckles and 40 years of work. But they weren't helpless hands. Diane stayed calm. Did you meet with Bob before preparing these papers? Kevin hesitated. No, I was told this was time-sensitive and that he had already agreed in principle. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes pain comes out sideways. I had not agreed in principle. I had agreed to listen to my daughter. There is a difference. After the call ended, Diane sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, he's not the villain here. I know. He may have been misled. I know that too. But knowing didn't make it easier. For the next few days, I carried those papers around in my head like a stone in my pocket. I'd be brushing my teeth and suddenly I'd think about Melissa telling a lawyer I was confused. I'd be standing in line at Kroger and I'd remember her asking about my bills. I'd be driving past the old shop on Wilmington Pike and my chest would get tight. The strange thing was, I still wanted to defend her. I kept making excuses. Maybe Todd had pressured her. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she'd seen one forgetful moment and panicked. Maybe this whole thing had started as concern and turned into something else. That's what fathers do, I guess. We keep looking for the good version of our children, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of us. One night I couldn't sleep. I got up around 2:15 in the morning and made toast I didn't want. I stood in the kitchen with the lights off, eating over the sink like a bachelor in a sad commercial. On the fridge was an old photograph of Melissa at age 7. She was missing both front teeth, holding up a fish she'd caught at Cedar Creek Lake. She had that proud little grin kids get when they think they've conquered the world. I touched the edge of that photo. And for one dangerous moment, I thought about signing. Just to make the conflict go away. Just to keep my daughter. That is the honest truth. Revenge sounds clean when people tell it afterward. Like a plan. Like a straight road. It wasn't. It was messy. It was me sitting in the dark wondering how much of myself I was willing to give up, just to avoid admitting my daughter might be using me. The next morning, Diane came over with a folder of her own. She looked tired. Not sleepy tired. Heavy tired. The kind of tired that comes from discovering something you wish wasn't true. Bob, she said, you need to sit down. I did. She opened the folder and placed 2 printed emails on the table. They weren't private messages, nothing illegally obtained. Diane had contacted an old real estate acquaintance who confirmed Melissa and Todd had been asking about my neighborhood, recent sale prices, and how quickly a ranch house like mine might move in the current market. They had described it as planning ahead. That phrase made my jaw tighten. Planning ahead. I stared at the pages. My house wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Karen had picked the wallpaper in the hallway. I had replaced the deck boards myself. Melissa's height marks were still penciled inside the pantry door from when she was a kid. and my daughter had been discussing its sale like it was a used lawnmower. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just sat there. Diane waited. After a while, she said, "I'm sorry." I nodded. That was the moment guilt started leaving me. Not all at once, but enough. I still love Melissa. That didn't change. But love doesn't mean standing still while someone measures the floor under your feet. For the first time, I stopped asking whether my daughter would hurt me and started asking how far she was willing to go. By the time July rolled around, I had made my decision. Not just about the paperwork, about everything. The house, my finances, my future. Most importantly, I had decided I was done being treated like a spectator in my own life. Still, I didn't want a screaming match. I didn't want lawyers battling each other across conference tables. And I definitely didn't want one of those ugly family confrontations where everybody leaves angry and nothing gets resolved. I wanted the truth out in the open. So I planned a cookout. Nothing unusual, at least on the surface. Every 4th of July, I'd hosted friends, neighbors, and family in my backyard. People expected it. Nobody thought twice when the invitations went out. Melissa and Todd accepted immediately. That told me something. They still thought I was going to sign. The afternoon of the cookout was beautiful. Sunny, low 80s. The kind of Ohio summer day that makes you forget about winter for a while. Around noon, I fired up the grill. The smell of burgers and bratwurst drifted across the yard. Kids chased each other through a sprinkler. A portable speaker played old country songs near the picnic tables. My neighbor Frank spent 20 minutes explaining why his lawn looked better than everyone else's. Nobody asked. He explained anyway. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Almost. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension sitting in my chest. Melissa arrived around 3. Todd followed behind carrying a bowl of potato salad. He shook my hand. Melissa hugged me. Quickly. Too quickly. Then she glanced around the backyard. Looking. Searching. Checking. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Diane arrived a little later. The second Melissa spotted her, her smile tightened. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for me. The afternoon moved along. People ate, talked, laughed. At one point, Frank somehow managed to tell the same fishing story twice. Word for word. Nobody stopped him. Again. Normal. At least from a distance. By 6 o'clock, most people had finished eating. The sun was beginning to settle lower in the sky. Long shadows stretched across the grass. That felt like the right moment. I stood up and tapped my glass with a spoon. Nothing dramatic, just enough to get attention. Conversations gradually stopped. Everyone looked my way. I cleared my throat. Thanks for coming, everybody. A few people smiled. I looked around the yard. Friends, neighbors, people who had known me for years. Then I looked at Melissa. Diane and I have spent the last several months getting my affairs organized. Immediately, I saw Melissa sit up straighter. Todd, too, I continued. I've learned some things during that process. The yard grew quiet. Very quiet. Nobody knew where this was going. Not yet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply started talking. I explained how concerned I had become after hearing rumors that I was supposedly losing my memory. Several heads turned. Melissa's expression froze. Then I described the legal documents, the request for financial authority, the conversations Diane and I had uncovered. Nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional, just facts, one after another. I could see people processing what they were hearing. Confused at first, then uncomfortable, then concerned. Melissa finally interrupted. Dad, that's not fair. I looked at her calmly. Which part isn't fair? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No answer came out. Because facts are difficult to argue with when everybody else can hear them. Todd jumped in. You're making this sound worse than it was. I nodded. Then explain it. Silence. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then Todd made the mistake that changed everything. A huge mistake. The kind people make when they're nervous. The kind that reveals what they're really thinking. He threw his hands into the air and said, "Fine, but what about the inheritance?" The second the words left his mouth, the entire yard went silent. Even the kids seemed quieter. Todd realized his mistake immediately. Too late. You could practically hear the air leave Melissa's lungs. A neighbor near the picnic table slowly looked away. Frank stopped chewing. And for the first time all day, nobody had anything to say. Because Todd had just said the one thing everyone was thinking. Out loud. I waited a few seconds. Then I spoke. "Funny you should mention that." Melissa looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her. I reached into a folder beside my chair. Not for drama, just because I wanted everything documented. "I sold the house." The words landed like a brick. Melissa blinked. "What?" "I sold it 3 months ago." Todd stared. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because their shock was so genuine. They had spent months planning around an asset that no longer belonged to me. "I moved most of my finances into an irrevocable trust months ago." Melissa's face went pale. Exactly the way it had the day she saw Diane in my living room. Then came the part neither of them expected. The part I had intentionally kept secret. Diane isn't inheriting anything. That got everyone's attention. Even Diane looked amused. I continued. "She's simply helping manage the trust." Melissa stared at me. Confused. Desperate. Trying to understand. Then I delivered the final piece. "Most of my estate will eventually fund scholarships for students entering skilled trades right here in Dayton." Nobody spoke. The breeze moved softly through the trees. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, and all I could think about was how peaceful I felt. For months I'd carried this weight. The suspicion, the disappointment, the uncertainty. Now it was gone. Melissa shook her head. "Dad, why would you do that?" The answer came easier than I expected. "Because those opportunities built my life." I paused. "And because my future belongs to me." She looked away. Tears filled her eyes. For a moment I thought she might argue, defend herself, say something. Instead she simply stood. Todd followed. Neither one looked at anybody else. They walked through the yard together. Past the picnic tables. Past the grill. Past years of family memories. Nobody stopped them. A minute later I heard a car door slam. Then another. Then silence. I watched their car disappear down the road. For the first time in years, I didn't chase after my daughter. I didn't call. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to fix something that wasn't mine to fix. I just stood there in the fading summer light and breathed. The morning after the cookout, I woke up before sunrise. Old habits. 40 years in construction teaches your body to ignore retirement schedules. For a few seconds, lying there in bed, everything felt normal. Then I remembered what had happened. The cookout. Melissa leaving. Todd's comment. The silence afterward. I stared at the ceiling for a while, waiting to feel victorious. I never did. That's something people don't tell you about these situations. Standing up for yourself feels good. Losing part of your family doesn't. Both things can be true at the same time. A week later, I closed on my new condo near Indian Lake. It wasn't large, just under 1,200 square feet. 2 bedrooms, a small patio, a view of the water if you leaned slightly to the left in the living room. Perfect. At my age, I wasn't looking for impressive. I was looking for peaceful. Moving day felt strange. As I packed boxes, memories kept appearing where I least expected them. The hallway where Melissa used to race her friends, the kitchen table where she did homework, the pantry door where pencil marks still tracked her height from age 6 through 16. I stood staring at those marks longer than I care to admit. Then I closed the door. Some chapters deserve respect, but they still need to end. The first few weeks at the condo were quiet, very quiet. I started fishing again. Not serious fishing. The kind where you spend more time thinking than catching anything. Most mornings, I'd take a folding chair down near the water with a thermos of coffee. Sometimes I'd catch a bass. Sometimes I'd catch nothing. Either way, I enjoyed myself. I also began volunteering twice a week at a local trade school. That turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd made in years. The students reminded me of younger versions of the guys I'd hired decades earlier. Some were confident. Some were lost. Most just needed someone to believe in them. One afternoon, a 19-year-old kid named Marcus stayed after class. He asked how I got started in the electrical business. We talked for nearly an hour. Driving home afterward, I realized something. For months, I'd been focused on protecting what I'd built. Now I was finally thinking about why I'd built it. That felt healthier. Melissa never called. Not in July. Not in August. Not in September. Part of me expected anger. Another part expected a lawsuit. Instead, there was nothing. Just silence. And honestly, the silence hurt. People love simple stories. Good guy wins. Bad guy loses. Everybody gets what they deserve. Real life is messier. Melissa wasn't a villain from a movie. She was my daughter. The little girl who once insisted on wearing rain boots to church because she thought they looked fancy. The teenager who cried when her dog died. The young woman who hugged me after college graduation and whispered, "We made it, Dad." I couldn't erase those memories. And I didn't want to. Several times I almost called her. Several times I picked up the phone. Several times I put it back down. Not because I was angry, because I knew the next conversation had to happen for the right reasons. Not out of guilt. Not out of fear. Not because someone wanted something signed. 4 months after the cookout, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. I was halfway through a meatloaf dinner and watching the weather forecast. The caller ID said, "Melissa." For a moment, I just stared. Then I answered. "Hello?" A few seconds passed. Then I heard her voice. "Hi, Dad." She sounded nervous. Older somehow. Not older in years. Older in experience. We talked awkwardly at first. About the weather. About work. About nothing important. The way strangers sometimes talk. Then eventually the real conversation arrived. Melissa took a deep breath. I was angry. I know. I felt humiliated. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I know that too. Another pause. Then she surprised me. She didn't ask about money. She didn't mention the trust. She didn't argue about the house. Instead, she said, "I think I stopped seeing you as a person." The words hung there. Heavy. Honest. Painful. I sat quietly. She continued. Everything became numbers, plans, problems. I kept telling myself I was being practical. I looked out my condo window toward the lake. The water reflected the last orange light of sunset. For the first time in months, I felt something loosen inside my chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe understanding. I wasn't perfect either, I admitted. That surprised her. What do you mean? I should have asked harder questions sooner. She laughed softly. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in a long time. Then she got serious again. I'm sorry, Dad. 3 simple words. No excuses attached. No conditions. Just an apology. I closed my eyes. Part of me had imagined that moment for months. When it finally arrived, it felt smaller than I expected, and somehow more meaningful. We talked for nearly an hour. Not everything got fixed. We didn't magically become the family we once were. Life doesn't work like that. Trust takes longer to rebuild than it takes to lose. But it was a beginning. Before hanging up, I told her something I'd been thinking about for a long time. You never lost your father, Melissa. The line stayed quiet. Then I added, but my life was never yours to manage. She didn't argue. She simply said, I understand now. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a while, thinking, listening to the distant sound of boats on the lake, wondering what Karen would have thought about all of this. Probably that families are complicated, and that love sometimes requires boundaries. I think she would have been right. Growing older has taught me many things. One of the most important is this. You can love someone completely and still protect yourself. Those two things are not opposites. Sometimes they're partners. The truth is, the smartest revenge isn't about hurting someone. It's about refusing to surrender your dignity. It's about standing your ground calmly enough that the other person finally sees what they've become. Melissa and I still have work to do. Maybe we always will. But today when she calls, I answer. And when I visit, I go because I want to, not because I'm afraid of losing her. That's a healthier place for both of us. If you've ever faced a difficult choice between helping family and protecting yourself, I hope this story reminds you that it's okay to do both. And if you've lived through something similar, I genuinely love to hear about it. Sometimes the stories we share help someone else find the courage they need.